Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're exploring how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone, done in partnership with Airbnb. I'm Pete Lyden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving these conversations. And today, we've got Rachel Botsman here. And Rachel is the author of the new book just coming out, Who Can You Trust? How Technology Brought Us Together and Why It Might Drive Us Apart. She's also the author of What's Mine Is Yours, a book that really explored the early, what you call the collaborative consumption economy, but we call it the sharing economy here. She's also a lecturer at the University of Oxford Said School of Business, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And
Who
a
can
long
you
way to
trust?
come here.
Question mark.
A question mark.
Yes.
Who can you trust?
That's question
I see.
mark,
When I
yeah.
said that, I maybe didn't make it sound like who can you trust? Question mark. Well, that's actually not a bad way to start. Well, here, actually, where I'd like to start, because you probably don't normally on this book tour maybe go this way, but we are rooting, a lot of our work for the last 2 years has been trying to really understand the sharing economy, the future of sharing economy, where it could go, how does it get regulated. So one of the things I really would like to start here is, since your book was so instrumental in that early thinking, I think it was 2010 it came out, if I recall right, early in the game of sharing economy thinking. Given the roots of that into this book, what were some of the roots of that thinking of the sharing economy that got you towards this book?
I guess the piece that always fascinated me about these platforms or marketplaces was how could you take these ideas that on paper seem really risky and crazy to people, and I was there in those early investment meetings when no one would back them because they were saying, you know, the consequences of when this goes wrong could be disastrous. It's not just, you know, transactional and anonymous through eBay. These are people's lives that you're talking about. And so...
Meaning, because I think in the book you talk about if someone rents a room in their house out,
yeah.
and something happens to that person in that house,
Or someone's in a car.
Or someone's in a car, exactly. So you're talking about the real serious risk.
Human risk, that they're really, you know, you're not just dealing with product online. And so I sort of became obsessed with understanding how strangers could trust one another through technology, and not just in the context of sharing marketplaces, but also on the dark web, which I find fascinating, that you can have so-called untrustworthy people and that you have these systems of accountability, and it kind of changes who has power in that marketplace, that the consumer suddenly has a lot of power. And then while researching that, there was this whole other sort of thread or hunch developing around the global implosion of trust. So, you know, you can't open the paper these days without seeing that trust is being eroded in some kind of major institution. And so I started to wonder, like, if these two things were connected, like how on one hand can you have people placing their faith on strangers and placing their faith in technologies, and on the other hand see this erosion of trust. And the way my brain works is I'm always looking for structural shifts. So I'm looking for the structural shifts. So if technology has this impact on human behavior, how does that structurally change things? And that's when I started to think, and I started this book really 5 years ago, that something profound was happening to trust in the world. I just didn't know quite what it is, quite what it was back then.
Interesting. So, well, let's open up those two pieces that you just said there. So, the backdrop of the eroding trust. Can you talk about a little bit about that, and to what extent do you see technology as really helping undermine that or accelerate that kind of erosion? Or talk a little bit about what you see happening there in the backdrop here.
So the erosion of trust, first of all, I actually do not like the narrative that trust is in crisis, because I think what it does is it further erodes people's confidence and faith in the system. So I think even the narrative in itself is a problem. And to answer your question, yes, the technology just amplifies those fears. It spreads the disease, so it becomes a virus to the point where we start to question the system, so whether it's the financial system or whether it's religious organizations or the media in itself, and that's a really precarious place to be. And the other issue I take with this whole notion of trust in crisis is that trust is so contextual. So when you ask people, do you distrust the media? And you don't even say, like, what kind of media it is, or which journalist it is, and you're not even trusting them to do what. So I think even the narrative that we've got stuck in around institutions, and I think what is actually going on is that the way institutions think about trust, that's what technology is disrupting. So like, I think of everything in design principles, and institutions still think that trust is something that kind of sits in communications, and kind of sits in governance, and it's something that can be controlled by the top, and it's something that's very hierarchical, and the people we trust, we still look upwards. So we still look upwards to experts and referees and regulators and authorities, and that's what I think is being disruptive, is the principles of trust, the rules of trust, if you like, are changing.
And institutional trust, as a trust in institutions is the key there, which is because you're actually saying, in other ways, there's a ton of trust out there that people are, we just mentioned, walking into strangers' homes and $1 million, $2 million a night. So the trust piece of the narrative is the institutions being eroded. When you think structurally about this is something I was going to talk about a little later, but since you kind of brought it out here.
Can I, on the plenty of trust thing?
Okay, go for that.
So one of the things that was most helpful to me was when I started to look at the principles of energy, because I was really interested in this idea that energy can't be destroyed in the world, but that it continually changes form. And this is how I think trust works. I think that we are naturally a trusting species, that we want to give away our trust because we understand as human beings that this is what enables us to connect and collaborate and place our faith in things and people, and to be vulnerable, which is a real need. It's a real sort of human condition that we desire. And so I think what's happening is that trust is changing form, and that's why it isn't in crisis, it's just moving in different places. And the interesting question for me is that sometimes this is an incredible thing in terms of enabling us to trust strangers, but it also means that we can end up trusting the wrong people and the wrong things. Because the institution used to play this really important role in telling us who to trust or what to trust. And when we turn to other people, it creates this information void where we start to become confused. And that's where you get some of the negative consequences.
So on the one hand, you have these relatively older traditional institutions losing public trust consistently, and that's going across the United States, Europe. Is it through all countries? I was wondering if China is it through all these different countries? So
it's the pattern is very similar across the Western world. There are some differences in the Middle East, even in parts of Africa, and definitely across Asia, where this inversion of influence isn't so strong. So there is still very much sort of an upward flow of trust to hierarchies and authorities. But I think the really important thing is when you say the word institution to people, and maybe this is because I'm British as well, people tend to think of a building. They tend to think of something physical and big. But when you actually think of an institution, what it is it's norms, it's conventions, it's behaviors. And so the other interesting thing is that the tech companies and the new institutions and attitudes of trust are also in sharp decline towards them. So I think we tend to think of like traditional institutions and the tech companies, whereas that dichotomy has now disappeared.
Well, that's a very recent phenomenon.
Very recent, yeah.
So before we get to that piece, because that's a really important part of this conversation, so is one of the systemic reasons why this general loss of faith or trust in institutions, is it driven by a big driver, is by digital technologies opening up access, transparency? I mean, talk a little bit about how much is it the problem as well as in undermining that trust, and then we'll get to the other side of things of how it's enabling this other kind of trust.
So my belief, what my research showed is the root problem, the root driver is down to lack of accountability. And this plays out in different ways, but this real sense of there's different rules for different folks. So why is it the elite, the rich, the privileged, why do they seem to get punished, or a lack of accountability, I should say? So the Panama Papers is a really good example of that. Lack of accountability also in the delay, and this is the real enemy of trust. When things are kept hidden or they're kept a secret for a long period of time, we don't trust the response. And then the third being just a sheer lack of penalties, which then further erodes people's faith in the system that anything has changed. So, of course, the obvious example of that is after the financial crisis. How could it be that so one person went to jail? Like, what happened to those captains of finance? And so the penalty becomes really important, because that's the symbol or signal to people that something really will change. And so you have the trust breach itself, where organizations and companies can actually recover from that. What becomes much harder to recover is when people think it's an epidemic, when they think that there's something wrong with the system itself. That's the viral piece that is really hard then to bring back in. And that's when the two other drivers that we've sort of talked about, this inversion of influence. Mm-hmm. So what is actually influencing your opinion on something, when that gets inverted and goes to the crowd. And then the role of technology in terms of just affirming people's fears, affirming their beliefs versus giving them sort of a different or a challenging point of view on this.
Do you feel that the lack of accountability and abuse of power in that is a more recent thing, or it's a thing that's been there, it's just has been exposed now finally in a different way? I
think there's always been a lack of accountability. Mm-hmm. It's definitely an exposure thing, so you can't operate behind closed doors anymore. Mm-hmm. I do think it's a scale issue. So it's the scale of these companies, it's the scale of the control that they have over their lives. And I think the other thing that's happening is this misalignment of intentions. So this sort of disbelief that whether it's a political party or whether it's a bank, how can your interests really be aligned with mine? And the questioning, I think, around that is new. The anger and the frustration and the fatigue around that is what we're seeing. And I think that is driving what we're seeing in the political landscape as well.
So flipping around then to the positive pieces of this. So meanwhile, technology is building these platforms, whether it's in the sharing economy or other platforms, that are allowing these direct peer-to-peer and person-to-person connections that seem to be inexplicably to some people becoming more trustworthy. So talk about that to someone that's trying to wrap their head around that sea change, because that is a very interesting flipping around the whole situation. Now, who would have thought? I keep thinking about this because who would have thought that a woman in a strange city, in a strange neighborhood, in a strange house with a key that she doesn't know who has, goes to a bedroom and goes to sleep, trusts that.
Yeah. Over a hotel.
Over a hotel, run by this hierarchical thing with the kind of the CEO doing it. But how is that? How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, when I wrote What's Mine Is Yours, the editor said, you need to change the opening because Airbnb is not going to be around by the time this book comes out.
Oh,
and I think it was always, I talk about this concept of trust leaps, and that when people are willing to take a risk to do something new or differently to the way that they've always previously done it. And what technology is doing is it's accelerating both the pace that we're leaping and also sort of the degree with which we're leaping. I think the interesting thing, and the example of sharing a home with a total stranger is a really good example, is because part of what you have to do to build trust is to reduce the unknown. So a lot of that can be solved with information. And so, like, I'm staying in an Airbnb at the moment, and the degree of information that you have around that person. Now, I'm not going to go so far, they don't feel like a friend, but they don't feel like a stranger. And this is what I think is really interesting, is that these signals that we used to use, these trust signals, are being digitized and even changing. So, and I think this is a huge challenge for brands, because the way that they used to signal that they were a mark of trust no longer necessarily applies. But what's happening is that you can now find these signals all over the web to get a much more complete picture to make a decision as to whether you trust that person. The piece I think people find, definitely people who are new to the space, or even when you think of it on a conceptual level, is what is the role of the platform in this? So is the role of the platform just to organize the resources, so to speak, to match supply and demand? Or do they have a responsibility in terms of, are they the trust enabler between the two people and then they sort of step out the way? Or do they have a responsibility of what actually happens between those two users? And that, I think, has become a key question even in the last year that has changed, where it used to be that the platforms were the coordination of resources, and they had a proactive responsibility to reduce the risk of bad things happening. But now what we're seeing is the pendulum swing where, no, you're not these neutral pathways. You now have a responsibility when things go wrong. And I find this really interesting because it's like, I hate to mention fake news, but or even content, right? Like, it's this, we love the idea of individual empowerment. We love the idea of direct interaction and control, but we still want someone to be accountable. But we should be careful for what we're asking for, because then that really gives the platforms even more control over our lives.
Or could. Well, this is interesting. So where do you stand on that little debate? Because I was going to ask you the same thing. Do people trust the people across the platform who they're connecting with, or do they actually trust the platform?
It's different.
It's
different. So I think where trust lies, what are the sources of trust, really depend on the value that's being exchanged in the experience. But they also depend on the company. So if you have a really trustworthy company, I think more trust flows from that corporate brand, so to speak, the platform brand. Whereas in some companies, you can have real low, like so Uber is a really good example of this. Like, people might say they don't trust Uber the company or they don't trust the team, but they have a lot of faith in the technology itself, and it almost doesn't matter because their faith is in the experience. And then, some users will say, I don't even care about trust because it's all about convenience anyway, which I find really interesting.
That's a little different. But it's actually, and we're talking about Uber, Airbnb, you've used some examples from the sharing economy, but it's really all platforms now are kind of, it's shifted to, there's definitely something, and we're sitting here in the Mission in San Francisco and kind of surrounded by it here, but it's definitely something seems to have shifted in the last year or so. Do you want to comment on what is happening in just the last bit of time here, and what you think is behind it?
So there is this really interesting question of accountability I think it's been brewing over the last 18 months. And with like all these things, like you can have the symptoms, but then you have to see the consequence of something for people to really take it seriously. And I do think the election and the Russians and the fake news, like this has become the thing now that people can pin the consequences of platforms not taking responsibility on. And so, I think any tech company that thinks they can sort of divorce themselves from Facebook is being rather naive. Like, even though they might have completely different culture and completely different operating principles, it's become toxic very quickly. And I don't even think it's for platform companies per se. I think it's for tech companies. So even like IBM and Microsoft and Salesforce, and it's anyone that's creating a product that is enabling you to do something that people are starting to say, what are your real intentions here, and how are you accountable when there is a security breach, when privacy is violated. And of course we see that with the Equifax data breach as well, that people are asking the same questions that they're asking Facebook, that they're asking Equifax, or similar questions, I should say. So these
So I think you're right. It's broader even than the platforms, but the platforms are kind of what's interesting, they've gone from the darlings, which could almost do no wrong, and we're to kind of to something that's not that. I'm hesitant to say they're going the road of Wall Street or the oil companies and stuff, because I do feel that there's something differentiated between that. Maybe you have some thoughts on that, but it feels like it's raising questions, but it's not necessarily throwing a pox on the whole and everybody. There's something about tech companies that they still like or trust, or at some level, or at least differentiate from, you mentioned, for example, the financial services crew and things like that.
I think there's still a belief in that they're trying to make the world a better place. I think there's still a belief that they're trying to enhance our human potential and human capability, which I think is different from sort of the role of banks. But I think ironically, because I do believe this is very much a scale thing, they're losing their humanness. And so what they're trying to find is this smallness within the bigness again. And so a good example is if they really started off about people and connections and communities and mobilizing people so that they could have different interactions. And then that gets lost to some commercial agenda, whether that be, oh, look, we have a whole community of pug lovers over here, and now you can sell pet food to them. Or through to, oh, look, there's a really popular part of the city, and landlords come in and commercialize that property. And so this, I think, is what the tech companies struggle with, is how they maintain that humanness, how they maintain that intimate connection. I also think there's something, like in the efficiency piece, like as they become more and more efficient, because that's what technology wants to do, they become a little less trustworthy. Because I've had companies and they call it friction. I call it human connection. And like you have to actually have a little bit of friction to build trust. So even things when you go to instant booking and you remove that exchange, and I know then they'll say, well, okay, well you have that exchange after you book. But you're in a different mindset around taking responsibility around that booking, because it was just something that someone made a decision for you versus you making the decision. So
just to unpack that for people who might not follow that exactly, it's like instead of you negotiating with someone in Airbnb, for example, for a room, and you're getting to know them, they're getting to know you, and you make a decision. Oh, great.
You go through all the search.
And there's a way that you connect in that, and you learn to trust through that. You're just saying by instantaneously booking, you lose that friction, but you also lose that connection. Is that
so it's like instant booking, or it's like when TaskRabbit, like it was an open marketplace, and they didn't go to instant booking, but they would show you 3 or 4 people, and then you have marketplaces like Urban Sitter that just won't go there, right? So they'll say, I'm going to give you the information, and I'm going to make some recommendations, but you, the user, have to slow down a bit and actually make the final decision. And so the acceleration is really good for conversion, right? Because you feel like, oh, Airbnb found me the perfect place, or TaskRabbit found me the perfect tasker, and so you just book that person immediately, but you haven't gone through that process of actually making a decision. So it becomes almost too automated in a way.
Interesting. Which, by the way, with more AI and things coming up, that might even get accelerated. Although let's hold the AI here for a minute. Here. That's a whole other topic we're going to get to in a second. Okay, well, this is a fascinating setup here. So here's what I would say is one of the things, and I was going to bring it up later in the interview, but I think it's you brought it up earlier, which is great. Is do you think, since you think structurally and systemically, do you actually think that what's going on here in some big picture way is that there were all these institutions that were developed in a previous era, 20th century or even longer if you want to go back, that worked well in the old way, bureaucratic, hierarchical things? I mean, what was the option back then? We didn't have other alternatives, right? And so that there is this sense that those things that once worked in the 20th century are now not working as well, partly because there's this new digital infrastructure, there's a new way of doing trust, there's a new way of some kind of institutions emerging, and slowly but eventually, surely, and that we're just trapped in this kind of transition point here, that we're kind of not knowing where we are. I mean, is that roughly kind of where you're kind of thinking, or could you want to talk about what you see the point we're in here in terms of the shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think not only are we seeing sort of a reorganization of trust, we're seeing a reorganization of the way we want value to flow, and sort of a redistribution of power. And those 3 things coming together are creating chaos. Because for such a long history of, more than 200 years, we're so used to the institution playing that role in our life, and somewhat deferring responsibility and deferring decision making. And suddenly people are under this tremendous amount of pressure to own things and transact directly with one another. And we think we want that, but we kind of want the institution in the middle of the distributed trust. And so that's why I think we call for things that we understand. So we call for like, let's have insurance, right? Like let's have regulation, right? Because they're risk mechanisms that we understand. So it's like the human behavior has advanced quicker than the new mechanisms to keep us safe, so to speak.
So I totally get the power shift, but talk more about the value shift. What do you mean when you say, unpack that a little bit about what you mean by shifting the values we hold central to what we want?
I meant money. I mean monetary. Monetary value. Again, that used to have to flow through an institution, and we're seeing all these. And I think, and then we're seeing all these ways to bypass that. So like the pipes through which value flow through are changing. But I actually think that's in the most nascent stage of transformation, is the flow of value, and not to go there yet, but that's where I think the blockchain piece will become interesting.
Well, let's maybe do go there. You're driving this conversation as much as me here, because it's definitely where I want. One of the things I want to go. So if we're at this juncture between these two eras, let's just say roughly that, and we're confused and we're kind of losing trust in one, but we don't really see what's going up next. There's several ways to proceed in that environment. One is to rethink the old institutions like regulation in the new context. And there's a lot of people in the future workspace thinking, well, how do we, what is an Uber driver? And they're not employees, but how do we think of, regulations over that industry? Or how and we've been doing a lot of thinking in that, frankly, and another project we're working on in the future. We're also thinking a lot about that. So we can talk a little bit about that. So there's a kind of a restructuring that old thing, but then there is truly new virgin turf ways to go. And so maybe before we go to the totally new virgin turf, actually, and where I think of it, blockchain, because that is a kind of almost a techno fix that would really, it's a stretch for people. Yeah. To what extent is there these medium-term transitions, like rethinking the rules and regulations around the sharing economy, or different kinds of codes of ethics of platforms, or new responsibilities that they need to take on? Are there any thoughts in that space of how we kind of go halfway there a little bit, and then maybe talk about blockchain a little more?
I have pretty strong views around not trying to look to solutions of the past to fix these problems. So I think the worker thing is really that people have become obsessed with what these people should be called. Right, so it's like we had these labels, these social constructs that we understand, so contractor, independent contractor, employee, and then the conversation began, well, maybe we need a whole new box. And as much as it's important of how people are classified, you lose sight of what the end goal is. And so the end goal is to really protect these people, right? It's to really reinvent a social safety net. And I'm not sure that now Uber drivers, for example, in the UK, that they're deemed employees. Are they deemed it now? Yeah, there was just a big tribunal case that went through, and they just lost the appeal, like literally 2-3 days ago. Whether that because a lot of people don't want to be called employees, right? So it's because the problem is so big that we go back to these near-in solutions of, okay, well, let's fix classification or categorization of these workers, and then we hope that the solutions will emerge, versus the more exciting stuff is to go, okay, we need to reimagine health benefits, and we need to reimagine basic wage, and we need to reimagine holiday pay, and that's where I would love the thinking, because then you're really solving for the future of portfolio work, which is the way work will be organized. I mean, you see the same thing with, a lot of platforms around food have been shut down because the only way that you can think about it is that you have to send an inspector who does a health and safety review of that kitchen or where that food is prepared, versus is there some kind of peer review structure. So my belief is that the solution has to be inherent in the system itself, versus a top-down form of compliance that just leads to more governance, but will break down again when these platforms hit another level of scale.
I completely agree with you.
Right, yeah. But it's a real problem.
It is a real problem. I mean, do you have any just thoughts on that before we move on? But like, how do we encourage more of that, or how do we get people to trust that we can figure this out? Because is whether it's right or left, there seems to be a bunch of people trying to keep us back in that old system, whether it's making America great again or resuscitating the trade unions and the, the job classification thing or something. And I'm just curious, any thoughts on how do we get out of that? How do we move that direction?
Well, so much I think actually comes from the DNA, the makeup of the regulators and the policy makers. And I think a first step is, if I were the platforms, I'd be sending I know they work in policy teams, but actually sending the best and brightest so that what regulation looks like and the role that it plays and the people who are going into those roles looks completely different. So I think part of the challenge is that the regulators come in and they do try and regulate things from the outside, so that their mindset is naturally more compliance is going to lead to more trust, which I don't believe is the case. So I think the DNA of regulation really needs to change.
Totally. And the personnel, essentially, not just through the government or institutional side, but you're also saying for the platforms, get the A-team to the front lines of these policy discussions at some level and get it figured out together. And
I think one of the challenges is that we're kind of missing influential groups and voices on these issues. So I'm being asked this question a lot around digital ethics and AI, where should it come at? Where is the most trustworthy place to actually drive this conversation, right? So we don't trust labor unions and lobby groups anymore, and even universities, and then big organizations like the World Economic Forum or the foundations. And I think that vacuum is really interesting in terms of who actually has the right kind of influence to push the conversation agenda forward.
Any thoughts on that? Where would you look?
I honestly don't know. I don't know what the DNA is of. I feel it when I'm in. I feel it when I'm in some kind of convening where people are comfortable being lost. They're comfortable that they just don't have the answer, and there is no precedent around this. But it takes time, and it is quite painful, and it's quite frustrating. And that doesn't happen when you're at a conference, and it doesn't happen when you're in a very public situation and you're under pressure to actually push something through. So it's new kinds of, it's even a horrible word, but think tanks are needed around this, where they've got a longer time to really brew on it in a way where it's kind of, it's a horrible word, but it's like a sandbox of thinking around this stuff where they can test it and they can get it wrong. And people won't say, well, that was a failure in the way.
Interesting.
I think cities, to be honest, that there's a lot of power in mayors and city structures, and that interesting things could come from the groups that manage the thinking around cities, that they could have a lot more influence in the future.
Totally hear you on that. And that's some of what we've been exploring here. In fact, we have had mayors in here and all kinds of things trying to think about if these little testing grounds, but I hear you. There is this missing piece. It was interesting. I was just a few weeks ago. This Tim O'Reilly you mentioned. He has a yearly gathering called Friends of O'Reilly, the food camp, and this food camp was around what to do about the future platforms and structuring the next economy. And it was one of those situations where you had a lot of technologists, you had a lot of policy people, you had all these and everyone was coming, and everyone was like, what are we going to do? But it was more of a not like anyone had the clear answers.
It's not prescriptive, right?
But it was essentially a collective sense that there's some moment here that we really got to start thinking differently in a fundamental way. And in that respect, I think it's a good moment we're in. The question is, I just hope it doesn't get too out of control here. But this is a good place to start moving into some of these other solution sets. So the blockchain, let's get into that, because there's an interesting opportunity there. And there's a whole crew that could follow the trust conversation we've had so far, this far. And then there comes a point where, how does trust operate in blockchain? That is, a lot of people don't understand. And so I'm curious how you're starting to talk about it, because we're well versed in it here, but I'd like to see how why do you see this as such an, you put 2 full chapters in it right at the end there on blockchain. And so talk to me a little bit about what you see that's so promising there and why you're so interested in the blockchain as a solution to, or one possible solution of this kind of shifting trust.
So I'm interested in, and often I actually don't even use the language of the blockchain, but I'm interested in things that can change the organization of value, particularly marketplaces where there is like a concentration of value. So publishing is a really good example for that, right? Where someone has so much ownership and power over distribution that you can only monetize things in a certain way. And so the book carries a price tag. I don't know what the American price tag is, right? And what is it?
27.
27, right?
Bucks.
Worth every penny. No, I'm joking. And the author gets 15% of that, which most people would be surprised by. And it's probably not what the reader wants. It's not what the author wants. And you're paying for the beast of distribution, right? And there's no way for me to take that book now and be like, you know what, the chapter you really want to read is chapter 3. You can go here and you can pay me 50 cents for that and be assured that 40 cents of those is going to go to me. That's an example where you have like a concentration of ownership and there are really restricted ways to monetize that asset. Energy is another example of that, right? Like, so if I have a little bit of excess power from solar generation, I can sell that back to the main energy provider, but how do I sell it onto my neighbor? Because do I really want to put it back into the central pipes? And so that's where the blockchain becomes really interesting, is that you can attach sort of micro value to things to allow people to share the value or the capacity of assets in different ways. So on the energy example, we now have an example in New York, I think it's called Transurban Grid, where neighbors are taking their excess solar power and selling it through the blockchain to another neighbor, and they're paying through cryptocurrencies. Imogen Heap, who's a really big musician, she's just put her single on the blockchain. And what that meant was not only could you download that single and pay her directly, but she could take all the strands of her song. So she could take like the guitar strands and the drum strands and even the lyrics, right? Like if you want to use a portion of those lyrics, and you could pay for them. And so I think that's profound, because that then starts to change the way you think about copyright. And so that, for me, like, forget the cryptocurrencies, the smart contracts, they are tools, but the bigger picture is really changing the concentrated ownership of assets and changing the way we can distribute value. I think it's really hard to get your head around, because there's, first of all, how the ledger works in itself. And then you've got this whole complexity now of public and private blockchains and what that really means. But if you actually, the way that you don't need to understand how the internet works, you just know that it's made it a lot easier to share information. I don't think we can yet even imagine how it's going to, we can't see how it's going to change the way we will share value and mean that we can share value more directly. Okay,
so given that you're doing this book tour and given that 2 of your chapters are there, so if you do explain cryptocurrencies first, because that's one chapter essentially, and blockchain second, how do you do that? I'm curious, because it's a tough concept.
It is a tough concept. I mean, it sounds so obvious. It sounds obvious, but to most people, you have to separate cryptocurrencies in the blockchain. So
I think that's very smart.
It's real. I know it's you get to the point and you're like, really? Like, do I have to? But it's like, okay, and then you start to say, okay, this was the backbone, or this was the architecture that the currency was built upon. But you can separate that ledger from the cryptocurrency itself. And then I think what helps is sometimes when you start talking about, so there's one cryptocurrency, there's multiple cryptocurrencies, they can start to see, oh, this is a thing that runs on rails, where you can divorce the rails from the train, so to speak. And then once you've got people there, then you say, okay, I find it really helpful for them to imagine a physical ledger, like an old-fashioned physical ledger. And okay, you have a physical ledger and I have a physical ledger, and I transfer an asset to you. What would happen on that physical ledger? And they'll say, well, it would move off your balance sheet onto my balance sheet. And you say yes, and there's a lot of friction in that process, right? And there's a lot of intermediaries that get involved. Yes, got it. Right. So what happens if that ledger now was digitized and it was shared amongst a lot of people who were all verifying the transaction? That's typically where you get like the whole mining and the verification of transactions. But then when people start to come around again is that this idea that then this transaction gets bundled into a block that then gets marked and timestamped on the blockchain, so it becomes immutable in that sense that you can't.
If someone tries to change one thing, there's all these other copies and everything.
Yeah, so I describe it like Django. You know that game where you pull the brick out the top and then the rest would fall, and so it's like take that one down there and the rest you can't actually do it. It's locked in the chain. But it's much more helpful when you start talking about. Assets that people can touch where they know there's a problem. And so diamonds are a really good example of that, where they lose their paper history. And if you could see the journey of that diamond over time, it would be a much better way to manage that asset. Artworks, wine. So when you actually talk about tangible goods, I think people, their heads...
You can see the what we call a paper trail, but you see it digital, immutable, distributed, open, transparent. I mean, there's a lot of things about it that, from a tech point of view, make sense. So then...
The transparency piece, I think, is difficult. It's a tricky word.
Okay, how would
because when you say the word transparency, then people, they think that you can see the name and the source, and then I think they think everything is tied then to that transaction. And you're like, but I'm not sure I'd want you to see that I own this or transferred it. And then you're like, well, no, there's this cryptographic key. And so I think the word... trustless system is very problematic when it comes to the blockchain. It's not a trustless system. There's actually a lot of trust required in the blockchain. It's just removing the trust that's needed between two people for the final transaction to occur. And the word transparency, I really have a hard time with as well.
Good point, good correction. So you did a pretty good job actually of laying out the blockchain, but why, when you're talking about the future of trust, say more about how that gets, where we are in that kind of future of blockchain and how that would play in a different kind of system of trust. Do you want to explain that a little more? Yeah,
because, and this ties back to our conversation of the platform and what the platform of the future is, because, so let's just give a real example like Airbnb, right? So you can have so much trust that exists between the individuals, but we still feel like we need the platform to broker the payment, to confirm the booking, to manage the guarantee or the insurance contract. And the thinking is, will the platforms become these redundant intermediaries because we can actually manage that risk and we can manage that value directly on the blockchain. So I could put my house on the blockchain and then you could rent it, and like whatever it is, 8 to 10% wouldn't need to go to the platform itself. So you're seeing this now with some, in Austin there's I can't remember the name now, but there is like Uber without Uber the company. I still think it's a long way off because...
Yeah, because it feels to me that there's got to be some kind of design way to connect that stuff, or maybe you could explain more how that would work.
Well, what happens there is that you sort of have to have collective responsibility of the behaviors of people, and I think it could happen, but I think it's a stretch too far, because even with traditional platforms, we have issues when things go wrong. So I personally don't believe systems can be completely decentralized. I think human beings, they naturally look for a center. They naturally look for some kind of leader or hierarchy, particularly when things break down. And like I tell the story, the extreme example of this is what they call the decentralized autonomous organization, which, talk about jargon, but where they wanted to see whether you could create an organization without a board or without any kind of leadership structure. So they created a venture fund that would basically automate funds based on votes of the crowd. And the fund got hacked into and was stolen, and it was actually a loophole in the code. And what was interesting is you followed the online blogs, they were all calling for the guys that created it to fix the problem.
The hierarchy.
The hierarchy, right? And they were like, but this is an experiment about decentralized autonomous organization, right? Like if we, and what was in, and they kept saying we'll set this really dangerous precedent that if something goes wrong, the leaders will, or the creators will always step in and fix the problem. And they eventually did, and that's exactly what happened.
Interesting. But couldn't there be, and again, we're getting theoretical here, so there's a distant future where maybe all raw individuals can deal with raw individuals. But on the other hand, it seems like the blockchain could also be used by the platforms at
Yes.
some level in a kind of intermediary stage, and it would allow the distribution of value, in your case, but money.
Yeah. I think we
And
underestimate.
talk a little bit about that, because I think there's some interesting, because one of the challenges of the platform right now is that they're amassing so much wealth in these relatively small companies with a relatively small amount of people, and nobody's getting the value spread through the society.
Yeah.
So there has been thinking about, well, how could you make it so everyone had a micro piece of those growing things, and then it would distribute itself differently.
Yeah.
Is that something you've been thinking about, or how you could think about blockchain being used in that way?
Yeah. So I think it has huge, like if we reimagine what the mutual is, or we reimagine what a cooperative, like it might look like in the future, that's where I think it could play a really interesting role. So I actually sit on the board in Australia of the oldest mutual. It sounds really boring. It's called the NRMA.
Mutual, meaning a mutual fund in America?
Well, no, it's like a mutual company. So any profit that we make, we have to reinvest in what's called a social dividend. And so basically what they do is, it's like the AA here, like they rescue people when they break down, which is a sunset business. So we have the responsibility of taking this 100-year-old mutual, which is made up of a quarter of the Australian population, their members, and thinking about its role in people's lives. And one of the things that we're thinking about is traditionally when we make money off the products and services we sell, we do something like invest in an electronic charging grid. And it's great, right? But it's not really distributing value back to the members. So we're starting to think through, like, how could you use the blockchain to actually, and does it have to be value that gets paid out, or is there some kind of dividend? You also see it, like you see when you run a mutual, how hard it is to have democratic voting structures, right? So whatever like mechanism you choose, you always have probably 2 to 3% of members with the very loud voice that's then influencing. So how could it change voting structures? How could it change people's say in a company? I think becomes really interesting. And so I've always been a really, where I started to lose faith with the sharing economy. And I feel like I saw it like when it was 2 to 3 years old, and then had really high hopes, which you could say were naive. But I knew it was breaking down when no one was changing the distribution of value. So when no investor was saying, we have to give value back to the people creating value. We have to give them some ownership in the companies themselves. And I think that was a big missed opportunity. And maybe that is the next wave along. And I don't think it's a traditional cooperative, but how could you share the value with the drivers on the platform? How could you share the value with the hosts, the taskers, whoever, the eBay sellers, whoever it is? And I think that's where a lot of the dissent is coming from, is that there is this resentment that we are the ones that produces value. We understand you orchestrate this in some shape or form, but are you really entitled to 25%? Are you really entitled to change your commission structures without asking us? Because without us, you're nothing.
Completely right. And the other thing is the lion's share with the equity goes into some extreme,
concentration.
Of
Yeah.
people. No, I think that's actually one of the problems in a larger platform economy is. I think they've just gotten so big, and this thing is complicated because again, I'm coming out of the tech world, so I get the value of it. It's like the idea of like there's a lot of discussion. Well, why don't we break up Google or kind of the old 20th century idea would be you take a big company that's growing big and you smash into pieces like Standard Oil or something and start all over. Except in a platform economy, in a digital global economy, there's value in a network effect of having everybody on the same platforms and stuff. Otherwise, so anyhow, there's a lot of things that in this 21st century digital world is not the same as just, take the old things out. And so there's a figure out is how, but I think what's freaking people out is how much wealth is getting amassed and not getting distributed. So I think that critical thing that you just said is how do we figure out a way to, and I also, I think the people at the top, honestly, they want to kind of do the right thing. That's what's another weird thing going on here.
No, I find it very strange because if I say anything positive now in the press or articles or speech about the entrepreneurs behind it's almost venomous, and this is where it's really like, how can you be so naive that you, and I'm like, have you met these people? These people, most of them, right? They're brilliant. They have the best intentions. Yes, they didn't see the unintended consequences of the scale that they were going to reach. But they're not evil. Like you're making out that they're just sitting there like going, money. It's totally right. I can't. It's so hard to even influence people's opinion anymore because it's swung so far the other way. And then,
agreed.
And I start to wonder, like, should the platforms? Is it good that they have a human face like Mark Zuckerberg, or does it just become a target? Like, it's really hard to solve this problem. I'm a huge fan of city planning and the way cities think about scale, and I wonder if the solutions lie in like taking the scale and literally dividing it into neighborhoods. Hate to go back to Airbnb, but like let the commercial landlords be in there, but they're in their own neighborhood. Right, and that neighborhood has different rules, and it has different tax structures, and it has different regulations. Let the people who are homeowners and are really dependent on that income to offset their mortgage and rent, and they're completely compliant, they live in another neighborhood. Then let the people like me who rent out their property like once or twice a year, like they're in another neighborhood. And to go back to our regulation conversation, I think this is that even the way we think of people, right, there's full-time professionals, there's moonlighters, there's the flexers, there's the people that full-time employment it just isn't an option. If we were actually thinking of these in neighborhoods, we would think differently about the rules that we were applying.
I like that, the neighborhood theory of scale. But one final question, though, on that distributing the wealth piece of it. Any thoughts on, because I think you've zeroed in there, and I think one of the critical things where there's a lot of goodwill on let's do something, and also we don't want to be the bad guys long term on this, and that is the critical thing. I think if that wealth got spread differently, I think it would diffuse so much fear and anger and all that. Any thoughts on that, of how you'd proceed on that, or any couple of thoughts on how do you, because again, building trust, it's kind of on your theme, is how do you rebuild trust, essentially, in this new economy a little bit?
Well, I can tell you what it is not. So the idea that I can amass all this wealth, whether I be an entrepreneur, an employee, or an investor, and then I will redistribute it through philanthropy. So I think it's about taking a significant percentage of the company, not all of it, and experimenting with different ownership structures. So you've seen companies try to do this, for example, through crowdfunding. But I think that's in the raising money versus once you're in the stage of the creation of value, and really thinking differently about dividends and what dividends could look like. And whether dividends are linked to how much value you create. So it doesn't have to be tied to like how much ownership you have. It's actually tied to how much value you create for that platform. So let's just shift with one little time going here a little bit, but I want to throw one other piece of the puzzle here that's clearly going to factor in somehow here. It's AI, the rise of AI, much more sophisticated, much more scalable. I mean, on the one hand, you could imagine that exacerbating these tech problems and these fears and various things. On the other hand, you could also imagine it being useful in redesigning our next systems and also maybe distributing wealth differently in micro levels and all kinds of stuff. So just give us your thoughts on when you wrap your head around AI, how does it fit into the kind of world you're seeing here, and how it fits into maintaining or not trust? Someone actually asked me, did you change your name to write the book? And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, Botsman. And I was like, no, I didn't. But so that's definitely not. The reason why I said that is when you say AI, I think people, they're trying to get their head around the manifestation of AI. Like, so they wouldn't think of it as like Netflix algorithms or anything like that. So I think there's a lot of confusion around what the term is. I think one of the most significant differences AI makes is if you think about trust and technology, if you think about that relationship, for a long period now, it's been on sort of the how side of trust. Right, so we trust that this microphone is dependable, we trust that it's capable, that it can do something for us. What AI changes is that the why side of trust becomes more important. So I don't need to entrust the integrity of that microphone. I don't need to trust how benevolent it is. But when trust and technology goes from the technology doing something to the technology deciding something,
I see what you're saying.
I now have to trust the intentions of the technology. Like a really simple example of this is Alexa. Right, so Alexa's not just doing things, it's deciding things. How can I trust that her intentions aren't purely commercial? So when Amazon introduces the style check feature, and that helps me make fashion choices in them, because you know what it is. You can stand in front of the camera and you put on 2 outfits, and it gives you a rating like 7 out of 10, 6 out of 10. And
no, I don't know that.
Oh, yeah, no, it's because they've just launched their fashion.
This is an Alexa thing?
This is an Alexa thing, yeah.
Okay.
So it's the next generation with the camera.
Oh, that one. Okay.
And you have to download Style Check, but you can literally stand in front of it and you can put on 2 outfits, and it would say like, I like the jacket, but change. And then it could actually it could look at my diary and go, you really shouldn't wear a print shirt, right, because you're doing an interview or something like that, and make recommendations. But you could stand in front and it could give you a rating, but then it would also say, I really like your outfit, but I don't like your shoes. Would you like me to ship your shoes to your interview this afternoon? And with Prime, then they can be there in the next hour. Right now, do I trust that machine's intentions, that it's to make me look better, or that it's Amazon trying to sell me another pair of shoes? So I think this is, or both, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is where it becomes really tricky when it comes to trust, because how do you trust the intentions of an algorithm? And what's going to happen in a very short period of time, because we're already doing it already, is that we're going to outsource our capacity to trust algorithms. And this, I think this is actually the root problem of what's going on with the fake news, is we recognize at the end of the day that part of the problem is us. Part of the problem is that we're the ones that have shared and digested this information without really asking whether it's worthy of our trust. But we don't want to admit that we're the ones that have outsourced the trust to the algorithms.
And since people are going to have a time trusting the decisions of the AI, it's really also going to get pushed back onto these tech companies, which are developing the AI, which is also going to heighten the scrutiny on those folks thinking, why are you doing this? What's the motives? Yeah, we're in a complex place.
Yeah, right? We are, and I don't, but people are like, we should understand how the algorithms work. I'm like, there's probably like 0.01% of the population that are really capable. So again, I think where we get so lost in this conversation and we end up down rat holes is we forget the end objective, right? And the end objective is, well, what is the end objective, right? The end objective is it that it's helping us as individuals, that it's taking collective responsibility for the world that we want to live in, that it's helping our lives, making us live better lives. And I mean, I struggle to reconcile that when you're fundamentally dealing with an industry that is measured by our attention. Like, it's measured by how much of our attention that they can capture and then monetize. And how can we trust the intentions of that? I find that really hard to get my head around.
Okay, well, we're coming towards the end of our hour, but let's think about a little more hopeful note here. We've gotten ourselves into a bind here a little bit.
And the book goes like that.
No, that's true. Although I must say it's generally a hopeful book. But let's focus on that a little bit here. Is what's moving in our favor, meaning the favor of a better outcome here, a next system of trust that actually connects people, makes them feel closer, that builds more trust in a society. I mean, if we had to think about positive things moving in our direction,
Yeah.
I mean, one, for example, I'd say is generational change. I mean, you know, that there's,
Yeah.
that there's a different wave of people coming in that trust the technology differently. We're watching the hanging on of an older generation that doesn't really understand things like Trump and others. But anyhow, thoughts from your point of view of like what's moving in the right direction here? That's good.
I think it's three things. The first one I should say is even realizing that trust is an asset. Which sounds like I think this is a generation thing, that it's something that we took for granted, but it's in fact very fragile, and when trust dissipates from society, it creates a very dangerous vacuum. So I think even the conversation around it is healthy, that we see this as something that we need to protect, and that it's not just an attribute, and it's not just a resource that will take care of itself, and that, you know, a healthy society is a trusting society. So I think that the conversation started is a really good thing. The second thing, and maybe I'm optimistic around this, is that I believe that this is the window of opportunity to really redesign the systems themselves, and that it goes back to our conversation around scale, that we've lost sight of people's real needs, and that if you redesign the systems so that they actually service people's needs, it starts to look very different. So how we use this moment of crisis to properly redesign systems, I think.
When you say systems, meaning, are you talking about technology systems?
No, like education systems,
systems?
health voting systems, health systems, payment systems, education systems, whatever it is, something that we need and delivers value in our life, and that you can apply different principles to that, I think is really interesting. And then linked to that, I think when we get it right, you know, let's face it, I live in a bubble, I would say you live in a bubble, we live in a very privileged bubble, and there is a lot of people, for institutional systems, they're not even an option, or they're left out. So there's a lot of good people who look bad by our so-called gold standards of trust. So there's a lot of people who don't have credit histories. There's a lot of people that will come out the wrong way in a criminal background check. And you know, you look at what's happening with emerging markets, where they're saying, okay, there's all different ways to assess how someone might behave in the future. There's always different ways, for example, to assess someone's propensity to pay. And we can actually look at the data that exists in their network. We can look at how trustworthy they are in really interesting ways. And that, I think, could lead to really interesting examples that are more inclusive. So just to bring this to life, a really good example of this is a company called Tradie. And they're looking at reputation data as it associates to risk. Right, and how could they change risk profiling of traditional insurance companies? But where it becomes really interesting is they're looking at situations where misinformation gives one side a lot of power. So the example I like to use is Landlord and Tenant bonds. So when you go to rent a property, you end up paying like 3 to 4 months rent, right? Because that landlord doesn't know how you're going to behave, and then you often don't get the bond back. But if you could actually prove that you have a good propensity to pay and that you are someone that is trustworthy around property, you can reduce that risk. And once you start to think in that way, like, you know, for example, they're looking now at women who stay in domestic abuse situations because they're so worried about that first month's rent, because they don't have their own credit histories. And so it's a waffly way of saying, like, the opportunity is there's so many other ways now to demonstrate that you are trustworthy. And if we get this right and we use technology in the right way, it could really unlock opportunities for people and make these systems far more inclusive.
I love that idea. But it's again, one more example. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but it's reminding me that essentially the body of work we're getting in this series and other series we're doing the last couple of years here is that the level of redesign of systems is more like, I'm starting to use the word civilization level systems thinking. I mean, the level of redesign that you're talking about is not like, oh, how do we reclassify workers?
No,
Like,
yeah.
it's kind of like, oh, how do we rethink trust and reputation
And identity
in a digital global planetary system that has never existed before. I mean, that's a different that's so profound at some level, and it's so deep. But in some ways, it's kind of the level we're in here. I don't know. And I just don't think people have wrapped their heads fully around the level of change maybe we're heading into. Or maybe when they are wrapping their heads around it, they're like, maybe that's what's freaking people out. I don't know. Any thoughts on like the scale? I mean, because everything you've said here is pretty
big.
Yeah.
And
we're pretty early, I would say, if you had to say. It's not like, oh, we figured that out, and just a matter of getting a few more votes and we'll tip it over or something. Any last thoughts, though, on our... The historical moment we're kind of in here? Is there something that gets you up in the morning and thinks, oh my God, we're like living in some kind of very different time here?
Well, the thing that gets me up in the morning and I really think about my work is I think what I want my work to achieve is I think human beings are actually deeply hungry for a restoration of faith. I think that's what's actually going on, is that all these things that we used to have faith in and that used to give us security and safety and community, whether that be faith in our local church or religious organization, faith in a political party, faith in even in the neighbors that live on our streets, that feels like it's dissipating, which is why I think the ideas that gain traction, something like Airbnb, yes, for some people it's just a cheaper way to travel, but it is definitely a search for that human connection that feels missing in many areas of our lives. So it's like, I always find it ironic that I study technology, but what I really believe in is humanness. And this, I think, it should be the end goal. I find it, I go and talk to these tech companies and I spend time with the executives and they're like, well, what should be our end mission? Because we've been working for like 5 years with this consulting, and I was like, it's to amplify what it means to be human. It's actually to amplify our emotional intelligence, not to replace it. And that's what gives me faith, because the end outcome is not, in fact, that complicated. And I think the companies that get that right, we see their success. We see how successful they are in relatively short periods of time because they make us feel more human and more connected to one another.
Final question, because you mentioned you have a young daughter who was traveling with you on this trip. I don't know, maybe still.
Yes, and my son too. So I think I'm bonkers, but yeah.
But when you think of their lives, are you hopeful about what the kind of future they're moving into? Are you worried, or how do you fall on that? If you had to be.
I worry, if I'm honest. I worry about their capacity to understand what it really is to be human. Like I often, not joke with my husband, but I've had some really interesting conversations with teenagers around gender and where they're getting ideas of gender from, because there's this whole transgender movement going on, and they'll talk about YouTube and and I said to my husband, like, that's the conversation now, but the conversation we'll probably have with Grace is she's going to tell us she fell in love with a bot. And how do I even have the tools as a parent to deal with the fact that she wants to bring a cyber lover to tea in augmented reality, right? And we laugh because we can't, but the technology is here for that to happen. Yeah. A boyfriend could represent itself and through artificial intelligence tell her everything she needs to hear and actually be the perfect boyfriend, because he can show empathy and understanding and be patient and be there over time. And then with VR, she could recreate him so he could come to Shabbat dinner, So that's what I worry about, is that I think my parents struggled with the phone, right? And I've got to struggle with all these things that are just not innate to me. So how I continually remind them what it is to be human, and how I give them the tools to make decisions and have the cognitive ability to deal with things when they break down, that they can't rely on the technology, is my biggest worry for them.
We have a few years to figure it out, right?
I don't think I do.
Oh, really?
I mean, I read...
She's like 3 years.
No, she is, but my son won't watch normal television because it doesn't understand him. Like, I mean, this is like, you know, when we got on a plane, he's like, where's Netflix? Because the thing doesn't know what he likes. So he can't, of course, he's not going to, you know, articulate that as an algorithm, but he knows the benefit that he gets from these things. And it's like anything, it's like Paw Patrol, boring, right? I hate Paw Patrol. So I think it's, you know, I think for the first 5-6 years of their life, you can control the technology. Like you can do, you know, you control when they get the phone or the iPad or those things. But they cross a line very, very quickly where they are very much in control. And so it's a very short window to teach them.
And then you better add it pretty fast here, figure it out. But anyhow, it's been delightful to have you here.
Yeah.
Fantastic conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Next time you come by, let's
bring my daughter.
Have another conversation.
Bring her bots, love her.
Exactly. Thanks a ton.
Thank you.